Awesome. So you all see this thing that says meaningful mentorship, building trusting relationships with students, which I'm super thrilled about to chat with you today. Up until this spring, I was a professor for about nearly 15 years. And so getting to do presentations like this really sort of bring me back a little bit. I'm excited to spend the next 3 or 4 hours chatting at you. No, I'm kidding. We're going to be going for about 45 minutes today or so, and then we'll have time for Q&A. And I'm happy to answer any questions that come up. So first, though, let's start with just a little bit about what Springtide is, so you can get a sense of who we are, where we're coming from. Springtide's fairly new. We've been around for just a couple of years. We're under the banner of the LaSallian Education and Research Initiatives, which houses St. Mary's Press here in the United States. Also, the genesis orientation of Springtide comes out of a project they did, which you might have heard of, called Going, Going, Gone, about why young Catholics leave the faith maybe 5 or 6 years ago, recognizing the need for a bigger lens to understand how young people are experiencing faith at the intersection of their religious and daily, lived experiences. Decided to start Springtide, and I was really excited to be in that sort of initial dreaming phase, and happy and pleased when the opportunity came along to be the inaugural executive director. We believe that no young person should have to navigate life's most important questions alone, so we conduct actionable research to reflect the inner and outer lives of 13 to 25-year-olds in order to help those who care about young people care better. That's sort of our mission in a nutshell. You all, obviously, the people who care about young people, we would love to do anything that we can possibly do to help resource you, to help you care better, not care more. We never doubt for a second the fact that people care enough to do good work. But sometimes we're not always working with the best information, and that's why we conduct this actionable research. And so we do research, but we do it in ways that I've been an applied sociologist, even in academia. I mean, it was sometimes a tough place for me because people would always want me to be more theoretical. Like, yeah, but how do people use this, right? And that's the same spirit that we bring over to Springtide. We collect a lot of data. We're really rigorous about our methods. I'll share some of that with you here, but the whole lens, even from the way we ask the questions, the way we begin to ask the questions, is informed through this idea of how are people going to use this in the real world as they interact with young people, because that's where our heart is with young people. 13 to 25-year-olds, that's the age range that we're paying attention to at Springtide. We wrap all this up in a process that we call data with heart. So it's not just that myself or our director of research are sitting around in a darkened room, like coming up with what would be the most interesting scientific questions to ask. We have all kinds of voices, that many of which you're going to hear from today, that inform our research process. We have an advisory board of experts from across the country who work with young people in a variety of contexts, from mental health to explicitly religious settings. They work in campus ministries, and all kinds of researchers who study adolescent and child development, et cetera, and on and on. We also have a young person's advisory board that meets every month, and they're often the ones who hear our research ideas first. They see the data first. They help us to understand it and make sure that we are thinking about it in the way that they would think about it. We have writers and residents, we have interns, we have a BIPOC fellow. I mean, we're really trying to combine a lot of perspectives so that we don't, the shorthand way that I keep telling this to our staff is, like, we don't want to be just a bunch of old people studying young people. It seems like a really bad idea. So we're really trying to get those perspectives and voices into our research, along with really rigorous data, and boy, do we have data. So over the last couple of years, we've done 230 now qualitative interviews with 13 to 25-year-olds. We've collected nearly 22,000 survey responses, and we've held over a dozen focus groups, which is a little bit more challenging in the era of COVID to do focus groups than it was before that. I want to start with this sort of broad, big view about the stories that we tell ourselves when it comes to religion. And in the United States especially, here's I just want to give you an example of how the way that we tell ourselves a story can get us off track. So we tend to look at national level data. So this is a trend from, or this is data from Gallup. How important would you say religion is in your own life? And we look at that yellow bar that's going up, and that not very important, that one along the bottom, and the green bar that says very important is sort of declining over time, and we start to get a little bit nervous about that. And then we see other data points too. Do you believe in God? 96% in 1944, down to 87% in 2017. And we start to get a little more freaked out. And then we see this, which comes from Pew, that the ranks of the unaffiliated are expected to grow due to religious switching, so primarily out of Christianity and into unaffiliated, with small growth coming in other religions. And these things tend to freak us out because we connect these dots, these data points, to these very real outcomes, like this article that came out from Gallup just this year. The U.S. church membership falls below the majority for the first time, meaning that the majority of people in the United States say that they are not members of a church. Now, never mind. I mean, this is obviously a trend that's been coming. I mean, when you talk about church membership to young people, they really honestly do not even understand the concept. As one adult was telling me the other day a story about their kid who, before the pandemic, was moving to college. And she said, "Do you want me to transfer your church membership to the town where your college is?" And her daughter was like, "What? I'm not leaving the country. Like, this is not transferring citizenship. So, like, what do you mean membership in a church?" That's not how they think about religion at all. So this trend about declining church membership is largely one driven by age cohorts, older people dying, essentially, not some dramatic shift. But we connect those dots, and so you can see that trend here. There's no cliff, right? This is just something that's been going steadily for a while. And then we get to the biggest data point. That's both a data point and an outcome. And it's what's called the rise of the nones, N-O-N-E-S, or the unaffiliated, as is the more technical term. This data here that you see on this chart comes from the General Social Survey. And Gallup and Pew and others chart the same trend, which is this rise in the unaffiliated part of the population. So when we ask them on the survey, are you Christian Protestant, Christian Catholic, Muslim, Buddhist, Jewish, Hindu, blah, 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 blah. At the bottom, there's nothing in particular, or agnostic, or atheist, and they combine all those last ones and they call them nones, N-O-N-E-S. That's a whole other thing we can unpack at some point. But nevertheless, what alarms most religious leaders is the connection that they draw between those earlier data points and this particular data point / outcome. And at Springtide, we find nothing to say that this trend is going to slow down. So where Gallup and Pew, General Social Survey, and others, they go down to 18, we think it's really important to understand what's coming. We spend the extra time and money and resources to go down to 13 years old, which is, we can talk about why. If you're curious, I can explain why down to 13. But we find that it's around 40% of 13 to 25-year-olds who claim no particular religious affiliation. And so what we're doing is largely telling ourselves a belief story that leads to an outcome of affiliation. The church is the religious leaders tend to tell themselves stories, whether it's in the US with these data points or if it's in a different international context with their own data points. It's only natural that we tell ourselves a story about ourselves where we are the central player, like we are the actor that matters. If it's Hamlet, we are Hamlet. If it's Mission Impossible, we are Tom Cruise. Those are the only two examples I can think of right now. But you get the idea. We went from Hamlet to Tom Cruise, right? You are, that is, we tend to think about, like, if the church is having a problem, it must be a belief issue. And the stories that we tell ourselves matter because it changes what we do about it. If we think that's the story that's playing out, then it's incumbent upon us then to fix those things. We've got to convince people to believe in God. We've got to get people to pray more. We need to get people to understand the importance of membership, etc., so that we can change these kinds of outcomes. Now, in a quote that's often attributed to Mark Twain, but is definitely not Mark Twain, even though nobody knows who actually said it, we just know he didn't. It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And part of what I want to get across today, especially first, is that the story that we've been telling ourselves about religion and young people is the wrong story. We've been telling ourselves largely a story about belief, but we don't really have a belief problem. we have a belonging problem. And the belonging problem is bigger than just the church. Nancy Emmerman, who's now professor emeritus at Boston University, has this great book called Sacred Stories and Spiritual Tribes. And in it, she writes this: in a time of significant change, we cannot assume that we will find religion in the predictable places or in the predictable forms. If we do not find as much of it in those predictable places as we did before, we cannot assume that it is disappearing. We are only just now coming to terms with the fact that more and more religion happens outside of traditional institutions. The story that matters is not an individual belief story. The story that helps us to understand what's going on is an institution's story. And that story repositions the church not as the main character in a play all about the church, but as one actor in a story that is largely about trust. And this is a critical shift. So when I say that the church is one actor on the stage in a story that's about trust, let me explain to you why I come to that conclusion. So I told you I was a professor. We'll have a quiz here. There's a bunch of data. What do you notice about what was going on about confidence or trust in institutions between the 1970s and today? I see a couple of light bulbs going off on people's heads there. I think metaphorically, not for real. And if you're having trouble, I made you a cheat sheet. There we go. Every single one of them declining. That's right, falling across the board. Now look, your head, your eyes, your heart probably naturally go to that bottom one, 65% to 36% with organized religion. And if that were the only one that we're dropping, we would be having a much different conversation here. I would say that we would be having a conversation about how this is largely an issue that the church created and needs to solve. And here's the key thing, is that when you've got a problem that just affects you, then you need to fix it. But when you've got a problem that is larger than you, that you don't really have any control over, you can't fix it. You have to respond to it. You have to change your tactics. You need to adjust your strategy. And we're going to talk about why that's so hard here in just a second, and why this particular understanding and reframing is so critical. But suffice it to say for now that this is a trust story. The church is caught up in this larger social shift away from institutions. Away from institutions. This is no different for young people. This is Springtide's own data here. We asked young people to tell us how much trust they had for these various social institutions. Nonprofits came out on top. But look, while you probably go right towards organized religion, again, you're like, okay, we're in the middle, maybe it's not so bad. This is a 10-point scale. So while it looks like nonprofits are doing great and maybe religious organizations are okay, we're in the middle, but nobody's doing all that well. Young people say the same things as their adults did on the previous slides over the last 40 years. This is a trend that has been going that shows no signs of slowing down. Young Catholics do have a little bit higher level of institutional trust. I'll point out some Catholic differences here as the presentation goes on from some of the data that we did for the Catholic edition of the State of Religion and Young People that we put out every year. So why? What does this mean in practical terms? Like, what has happened? Well, let's think about what all of that sort of looks like through the lens of one person. And we can sort of, like, if we were to think about explaining this loss of institutional trust to somebody like my grandfather, I think it would largely be incomprehensible to him. I wish he were still alive so we could have this conversation and see exactly how he responded to it. But I mean, it was just a much different world that he grew up in. He grew up in northern Minnesota, which is basically Canada, and worked in creameries, was a high school athlete, fought in World War II, went from no indoor plumbing to putting kids through college, just all kinds of things. Now, what all those had in common were that the institutions in his life really worked for him. They were like public education worked for him. A large corporation that he worked for retired with an actual gold watch. Are any of you planning to retire from ministry with a gold watch? just by quick show. No, Vivian's laughing. You're not supposed to laugh at that, Vivian. Nobody's thinking about a gold watch when they retire from it. Anyway, so he, retired from Land O'Lakes with a gold watch. We still have it. He fought in World War II as a member of the United States military, which was obviously one of the most important wars that's ever taken place against this great force of evil. He comes home. He uses the GI Bill to help buy a house, which nobody in his family had owned a house before. He's lifting his entire family up out of poverty, and retires. And you think about how weird that is. I mean, retirement is such a weird thing in the scale of human history. It's just like the last blip on the radar that people got to actually retire and do what they wanted, in large part because of social safety net programs like Social Security and Medicaid and Medicare, et cetera. He joined clubs. He was proud of the social clubs that he belonged to. And I wouldn't even say that like he belonged to those things as much as those things belonged to him. Those various institutions that supported him and like they made up his identity, really lived inside of his heart. He wore the gold watch after he retired. He was proud to say what church he went to. It was the way that he introduced himself, as did many others in his town. In that world, I think it's pretty straightforward what you need to do. All you have to do in that world to gain trust or influence over somebody is to align yourself with one of those institutions or a combination of them. And then you automatically get some authority over the people who identify themselves with that institution. When I asked my dad, who grew up Catholic and is still Catholic, by the way, I probably would have been Catholic, except that my parents had a literal coin flip at the dining room table when I was going into middle school, and my mom was Lutheran, Northern Minnesota. Dad is Catholic, and my mom won, so I ended up getting confirmed in the Lutheran church. I'm pretty sure that if she had lost, we were going for 2 out of 3 and 3 out of 5, and so on and so forth until she got enough heads in a row. But nevertheless, I said, I was sharing this with him, and I said, is there somebody that you can think of that, that you would say, like when you were growing up was really important to you? And he mentioned the priest. And I said, well, that's really interesting. I don't remember a priest. I don't remember you talking about a specific priest. And he's like, oh, no, not a priest. Like the priest, whoever the priest happened to be at whatever church they were going to, depending on where they lived or as they were rotating in and out, that I would have listened to what he had to say. And I think in that exchange, you start to see how much of a disconnect there is. When he was growing up, he wouldn't even have to explain that answer. But by the time I'm asking him these questions, I'm assuming the exact opposite, that we're talking about a specific person as opposed to a person who occupies a position. And when I explain this to my students when I'm teaching sociology of religion, they audibly laughed at the notion that my dad would have just trusted whoever was up in the pulpit giving the sermon, regardless of whether or not he had a relationship with that person or knew them in any way, except for wearing the collar. I think that is an anecdotal insight into what this looks like on the ground. Now, when we look at this in terms of research, we see much the same with the young people that we've surveyed. 85% of young Catholics say they are more likely to take advice from someone who cares about them. 30% say that impressive job titles do not matter to them. And 11% say that if someone has an impressive job title, they automatically do not trust them. They automatically do not trust them. Now, the secret here comes back to this institutional story. It's because those titles, that alignment with the institution, what young people are doing, and increasingly adults too, is they're saying, you represent the institution and I don't trust the institution. So the more that like I'm supposed to trust you just because of your credential, the less I'm inclined to do so. But this is not just a religious story. I saw this in my time, even as a professor. I started teaching my first classes in 2007 or so as a graduate student, finished up that time just this past spring. And even then, I remember walking into classrooms in 2007 when I did not have a PhD, was not a professor, and students automatically like straightened up. Well, it's as much as students do. Got out their notes and were like, okay, let's roll. Like, what you're going to say things, I'm going to take notes. Like, maybe we'll have a conversation or whatever. By the time we fast forward to 2020, 2021, my students need, like, that is not the automatic. The automatic thing is to challenge, to learn through dialogue. that they think that I'm there on behalf of the university, not on behalf of them, until I prove otherwise. Now, we see the same thing playing out in all kinds of places too. How often do you go to your doctor, you get a diagnosis from somebody who's trained, professional, credentialed, and then you immediately go and look it up on WebMD and you ask all of your friends who might be like, I don't know, graphic designers, what they did for their knee replacement, as if that could possibly matter, right? But that often is how we're sourcing information. And this is not just a story that's playing out in one field. This is a story about mistrust in every field. So the world is not nearly as simple as it once was. It's way more complex. There's a lot of things competing for people's time and attention. It's not just a few simple institutions that we revolve our lives around, especially for young people. We're more global, we're more diverse. Sports and entertainment take up a bigger chunk of the time. We still have these clubs, we have all these identities that play out online, and on and on and on. And I think there's a big difference between that world and this world. Because in this world, the more you align yourself with an institution, the less authority you have in the life of a person. Because even though those institutions may be more diverse and plentiful than ever before, our trust for them is lower. So the more that you sort of couch yourselves, stake out ground in just one of these things, not only is there all this other stuff competing for their time, attention, and loyalty, and you're just now one of many as opposed to one of half a dozen. But when you double down on that in the context of this change that Nancy Ammerman referred to, this changing landscape, which means this decline of trust for these things, they don't live in that person's heart anymore. The person stands in the center of them and takes bits and pieces from all of them, the bits and pieces that work for them, where they get to be their full self. So let's take a look at what this means in the context of young people and religion specifically. So we used to use this marker of affiliation, which as like a shorthand or like a proxy. If somebody said they were affiliated, so in other words, if we asked them like, hey, what religion do you belong to? And they raise their hand and like, I'm Catholic. That counts as affiliation. We used to use that as like a proxy to reasonably assume a lot of things then about that person. In particular, we would probably say, like we could say with confidence, maybe some things about, how often they pray. If they believe in a higher power, they probably go to church. They might read the Bible. Well, not Catholics, but Christians would read the Bible, et cetera, et cetera. And the thing is, like, that's just not the case. So what we've got now is a much more diverse set within that container of affiliation. 52% of affiliated young people and 49% of young Catholics have little to no trust in organized religion. In other words, they're raising their hand and they're saying, yes, I'm Catholic. And then you're like, okay, next question. Do you trust organized religion? Like, oh, no, not really. How weird is that? 1 in 5 of young people who tell us they're affiliated tell us that they're not, though, a religious person. 1/3 of young people attend religious services once a year or less, even though they claim an affiliation. 1 in 5 tell us that they do not try to live out their beliefs on a daily basis. And as if that isn't confusing enough about that container of affiliation. I'm sorry, before we get there, we've got Monica, who I think sums this up great with this interview quote. I guess if you have to put a label on it, Christian, but with everything in today's world, I literally don't know. I just think spiritual, maybe. I think the problem with that is when Monica says, I don't know. I think that speaks to a lack of mentors and adult leaders and guides in her life. That not that we should necessarily have certainty, but her like, I don't know. Like it almost seems like it hasn't been super well considered for Monica. And that seems like a job that adults should be doing with her. So again, as if all of that is not confusing enough, it's the same story for the unaffiliated. Just as we used to use affiliation as proxy for knowing what somebody was, we use unaffiliated in the same way. If you're a nun, it means that you probably don't believe in God or a higher power or the divine, and you're certainly not attending worship services if you're not affiliated. But the story here is just as complex as it was on the other slide. 60% of young people say that they are at least slightly spiritual. Over 1/4 try to live out their religious beliefs on a daily basis, even though they're not affiliated. 38% of unaffiliated young people say that they are religious, and on and on. We find as much diversity within these containers as we do between them. where we used to sort of like the sort of dominant idea was that if we could just know if somebody's affiliated, then that would tell us a whole lot of things about them. And that the real difference came between the categories. Well, now we're starting to know that those categories really don't mean anything at all in the 21st century, especially not for young people. But that's the wrong way to think about their faith lives. That's us trying to package them into a belief story when what's really going on is that we're acting out a play that's really about institutional trust. Because what these categories do have in common is if we were to repackage them in a different way around trust, these data points would start to make a lot more sense. So sure, I'm not going to claim that I'm affiliated. 60% of unaffiliated young people like raising their hand like, no, I'm not signing up for any of that. Don't put me in a box. I don't want to be a church member or whatever that means. But then you ask them if they're spiritual or religious, and they're like, oh, sure. Like something like 2/3 of young people are either religious or spiritual. It's like, yeah, but I'm not going to, I'm not like Lutheran, but like I'll be spiritual. That means like they're open to the conversation, right? They're trying to live into a lot of these principles. People who are affiliated are like, just because I show up here doesn't mean that I belong here. We wrote a whole book about that. Where's that? Yeah, this was the first study that we ever did called Belonging. And one of the things that was really shocking that came out of Belonging is this notion that just attendance alone does not indicate a sense of belonging. It's a spoiler alert, it's attendance plus relationships. So relationships that get people a sense of connection. And in fact, it's relationships that are actually the most important thing to understand if what we really want to understand is a young person's faith life. That's where the secret is. It's not in whether or not they are a member or they do pray or they claim an affiliation. It's who do they have a relationship with. And sadly, increasingly, young people just don't have the kinds of relationships that they need. And largely that's because we are living in my grandfather's world. We're living in my father's world a lot in the church, where it's like relationships. I'm not so sure that we need relationships. It's not a priest, it's the priest. They need a connection to the institution. That's what matters, not a connection to a person. And so we keep believing in that world of very few institutions living in somebody's heart without recognizing that the world has changed. And so therefore, we need to change, not what we believe in, but how we approach this kind of work. And young people just don't have these relationships. They don't have them in the ways that we think that they should. In the ways that research has shown to be really important. 27% of young people have one or fewer adults in their life they could turn to if they needed to talk. That includes their parents. So let that sink in for just a second. 1/4 of young people have one or fewer adults they could turn to if they needed to talk. And at the bottom there, when we ask, this is a check all that apply, adults I have in my life that I could turn to if I needed them, parent and guardian comes out on top. And again, they could check every one of these boxes if they wanted to, but only 8% pick religious leader. That number changes, these numbers change just a little bit with young Catholics. Catholics have a little bit more connection overall, but fewer are connected to a religious leader in particular, indicating something there, I think, about community. Now, the way this is felt in young people's lives is through this, there we go, is really acute. And it came out in our qualitative interviews a lot. In some really poignant ways. Megan says this very clearly: nobody cares, nobody is really listening. Critically, I mean, there's a heart moment there. We just feel badly for Megan. But also there's a head moment there where you realize that Megan is equating care with listening. Not with the amount of time or money or effort spent, not with the perfectly run retreat or mission trip, but with listening. That's how care is experienced. And we're going to get into why that's so important. But before we do that, I just want to, let's return to this graphic for just 1 second. So conceptually, what do we need to do in this world? If we know that the more we run back to our institutions, the more we go behind our titles, or lead rather with our titles or our positions or our institutions, the less influence that we're gaining, because young people see us as aligned with an institution they inherently don't trust. I think the way forward is to replace all those institutions with people. It's the people that live in the hearts of young people. It's the people that young people are connected to, the adults, the trusted adults in their lives, that they tell us consistently that's where their sense of belonging comes from. That is how they explore and make sense of their faith worlds. In the State of Religion and Young People for 2021, which we are in the process of, we finished the writing, it's in the design phase, it'll come out in October. We explore this concept of faith unbundled as young people are trying to navigate their faith lives in a world without sort of institutional guides. We find that it's really those individual people who are willing to walk with him, as the Pope says in Christus Vivit, to accompany them through all these explorations that make all the difference in the world. Now we know this not just from you know this, you experienced this, you said it in the quiz that we took, the Slido thing before we even started this. You all understand the importance of relationships, but I want to share with you just a little bit about why, outside of either your own felt context or even a larger theological religious context, we know this is true from the social sciences too, that belonging precedes believing. So my discipline, sociology, is relatively new in the world. I mean, it was only started like 125 years ago or something. But one of the very first studies that launches sociology, which is the study of groups of people as a discipline, is this exact question. How do groups of people form? What holds them together? And ultimately, it's a sense of belief that keeps them together over the long haul. But what gets them together in the first place is a sense of belonging. Now, we get this backwards all the time, not just in religion. We get it backwards in politics. We get it backwards in all kinds of places. We want to say you have to, once you can get yourself to believe in X, Y, and Z, then the community is there for you. Or like, if we can just teach you all of these things that you need to know, then you'll have this feeling like you belong to this larger group. It does not work that way. We have 125 years worth of studies in a lot of different fields to help get us to that point, but it's very counterintuitive. Because what happens is that when we get, especially a young person who's, their hormones and all kinds of things are going, like this, we can get these like little short-term wins about belief, right? Like brains aren't even fully developed until a young person is in their early 20s, mid-20s, sometimes never for some of the people right? So we can get these short-term wins and it feels like it's done. But remember, the hallmark of a young person's life is not coming to understand yourself. It's the process of understanding. It's change. Change is the universal thing for young people. Exploration is the universal thing for young people. So if what we want is like a really durable sense of faith that can sustain moving to a new city for college, getting a new job, a pandemic where you're relegated to your home, the thing that will carry us through those things is a sense of belonging to a group that shares a common set of beliefs. It's not a set of beliefs first that then maybe connects us to a community afterwards. But how do we do that? Well, as I said at Springtide, we are much more interested in being, what I say on the research side, we have this mantra that we say all the time: we want to be useful, not interesting. So it's really easy with research to just find yourself being interesting. But ultimately, that's not what we're after. We want to be useful. So we design these things from the beginning to help reveal some frameworks or something that might work for people. And what we think has emerged here is this new model for this new world called relational authority. So as opposed to this sort of like pre-modern world where authority was given to you based on some heritage or lineage, what we call solidarity of sameness in sociology, that is, that like somebody's daddy beats up somebody else's daddy who beat up somebody else's daddy, and so they get to be the king, right? And therefore they get authority. And then we moved into this relatively modern world that my grandfather and my father inhabited, which is a solidarity of difference. We don't all live the same lives. We don't trust people who, like, just because they've been around. In fact, I don't even know what my neighbors do for a living. Instead, we've sort of substituted proxy in for common experience. We substituted credentials in for common experience. So like, I'll go to the dentist, and the reason I trust my dentist is because they have like almost literally like a wall full of diplomas saying how dentist they are or whatever. Nobody was signing up to take classes with Josh Packard. They weren't even signing up to take classes with Dr. Josh Packard. They were signing up to take classes with professor of sociology at X university so they can get Y degree, right? We occupy slots inside of institutions, and those slots are convey some sort of credential or authority. But hopefully based on expertise, usually based on expertise or some experience. But the model that we need now needs to combine both of those things. Some notion of commonality along with expertise. And it consists of these 5 dimensions that young people spelled out for us pretty clearly. Listening, transparency, integrity, care, and expertise. Now we're going to go through each of these in turn and spend just a minute or two on each one. We dig into this in the State of Religion and Young People from 2020 called Relational Authority that you see behind me. It's a free download. You can get it on Kindle or Apple Books. If you want a print copy, they're super cheap thanks to a generous donation. So I'm not going to like walk you through in depth, but we do need to spend some time with each one of these to help understand how they're enacted in young people's lives. And really critically, what I want to come through here is that last piece about expertise. Listening, transparency, integrity, and care. If you just do those 4 things, then you're just going to be like a cool uncle or like my awesome aunt. And as we'll see, young people don't want another cool uncle or an awesome aunt. They don't want an adult friend. They want your expertise too. But if you just come with expertise, which is that model that my dad was talking about, and if you don't do those other 4 things, you'll never get anywhere. Because they see your expertise as aligned with your institution. Because it's your institution that confers your credential. I mean, you see this chain that I don't want to keep beating a dead horse here, but you see how those things are connected. And again, when you don't trust the institution, and then therefore you don't trust the credential, and you don't trust the person who has that credential in that institution, if that's the only thing you're coming with, you're moving backwards with that young person. Let's take a look at what these look like. Alex says, the reason I stayed at my church was because of my priest. He gave such great homilies and really knew his theology. Nope, no young person ever said that in any interview that we've ever done with any young person, period. Every single time we talk to a young person about why they stayed at a church or why they got connected to one in the first place, it was always, sometimes it was about a priest, sometimes it was a youth minister, sometimes it was a lay person, but it was always about a relationship. Every single time it was about a relationship. And those relationships almost always start with listening. If you could do nothing else, I would say let's think about listening. 84% of young people say they will trust someone who remembers things they've shared. That's what listening looks like. 82% will trust someone who takes time to hear what they have to say, taking the time. That's what listening looks like. 78% feel listened to when people show they understand what they've been through, being empathetic. And we know this from the social sciences too. Communication, like here's a quick way that we can just do listening. Very physically, communication researchers call us having an open posture physically, that we're not like closed off, we're not checking our phone all the time, but rather we're leaned in, we're open, we're making eye contact. Young people's experience with adults, they tell us, is of being dismissed. They don't expect to be taken seriously by adults. And so one of the other things we can do is to make sure we ask follow-up questions. I learned this, it took me a long time to learn this lesson. I would have students in my office that I genuinely cared about and wanted to know more about. And I would say, what are you going to do when you graduate? And they would give me some answer like, I don't know, I'm still thinking about it, or maybe going to social work or something, because they think that sociology and social work are like the same thing. It's fine. I'm not bitter about that. What took me so long to realize is like they have perfected the art of giving an adult just enough of an answer to shut them up. That they because they don't think that you really care about the whole thing, right? They think that you're just asking it to do your job because that's your job as a professor or a youth director or whatever, campus minister. It wasn't until I started asking the follow-up question, they would say, I want to be a social worker. I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. Tell me more about that. Where does that come from? Do you know any social workers? Why do you want to do that? You've all seen this, no doubt. You're good at your jobs. Without anybody telling you to do this, you probably just stumbled into doing this. So this is not news to you as much as it is affirmation that like that thing works for a very specific reason. That thing works because you're disrupting their taken for granted. Yes, that's a missionary question. That's right. That thing works because like you're disrupting this taken for granted notion that adults don't care about young people. That's the expectation walking in, regardless of your title, regardless of your office. That is sort of it's very difficult for a young person to sort of switch that off, especially when you're meeting them for the first time, because that's how they're walking around the world the rest of the week. Is like, oh, adults are just doing adult things and I'm sort of here, and they would like to end this interaction as quickly as possible. I had an Instagram live with Rabbi Joshua Stanton a few weeks ago, which we've had a chance to talk to some really fascinating leaders from across different religions, campus ministry people. They're all on our YouTube channel if you're ever interested in listening to them. But he said this fascinating thing. He said, religious leaders who don't listen well shouldn't expect to be listened to, which I thought is just such a great way of summing this up. Now, I totally get why we don't often think that we're doing anything when we sit and listen. We think like, oh my gosh, I really don't want this young person to think that I'm okay with all of the things that they're telling me, right? Like we think that if we listen without correction when they tell us about the really terrible choices that they're about to make or have made or are making on a regular basis, then they're going to think that like I'm signing off on that. But young people don't think that. They tend to know when they're screwing up. And furthermore, although they want your expertise and your correction, it's not going to come until they're not going to be ready to listen to it or willing to listen to it until they have felt heard. This is why the listening part is so critical. Part of that, but not exactly the same, is about transparency. 80% of young people or so say they trust someone who shares things about their life. And that's going to be really tricky. You're working with young people. How much of your life do you share? So I think this is, your professional guidance and expertise has to come in there, but young people want to know that you've been through something like what they've been through. They want to know that you've struggled and had doubts. It's a key way of building trust. We know this not just from experience. Again, we can look to the social science here. And what happens when we share something about ourselves is we start to engage what social scientists call norms of reciprocity. And then you've experienced norms of reciprocity in your life. Maybe you have a friend that got you, not like a friend, but like almost a friend who got you a birthday gift one year, and you're like, oh, crap. Because what does that mean? It means you've got to get them a birthday gift. Or like, you have somebody over, like we have these friends that we, obviously when we first met, we weren't good friends yet. It's like 3 years later, we're really good friends with them, and we're still bringing flowers and or a bottle of wine over every time we come for dinner. And then finally I was like, can we stop this? Like, this is ridiculous. We're having dinner once a week. We don't need to keep trading bottles of wine. Or when you open the door for somebody, they walk through, they get to the next door, and they open it up for you. I mean, this is what norms of reciprocity are. They create what sociologists call this like indebtedness, where we feel the need to repay the thing that was just done for us, and ideally as quickly as possible. So when you share something about yourself with a young person, not only does that create a certain amount of trust there because you've revealed something about yourself, but it also opens up this expectation that this is a space where that kind of sharing happens, and I would like to repay that as quickly as possible. You don't have to see. You don't have to explicitly say it. We just feel it. We want relationships to be in balance with each other, and so you being transparent about something can encourage the person that you're sitting across from to be transparent with you about what they're going through. Additionally, this creates establishing that you've been through something similar to what they've been through puts you in their in-group as opposed to in their out-group. And when you're in somebody's in-group socially, you get a whole lot more leeway than you do if you're in the out-group. We tend to be more forgiving of people in our in-group. We tend to be more understanding of the decisions that they make that we don't necessarily like or agree with in the moment. For out-group members, we stereotype more, we tend to paint with a broader brush, et cetera, et cetera. You really want to be in an in-group with somebody if what you want to do is to be able to influence their behavior or belief or decisions. Integrity, what does integrity look like for young people? Integrity, 80% of young people trust someone who admits when they're wrong. And basically it looks like following up, following through, being accountable, and being authentic. Integrity is big for building trust. It's a hard one. We don't, as religious leaders, often we feel like we have to have all the answers. And so when we do make a mistake, it somehow has to be like not real, or we want to downplay it or something. And you can begin to see how this overlaps with transparency. But basically, can we say what we will do and then actually do it. And then if for some reason we aren't able to do that thing, we have to own up to it. And we have to be accountable to why we were able to attend that event that we thought we were going to be able to attend, or why our behaviors in this moment didn't align with what we professed to be our beliefs in the past. Care looks like time. Very, very bluntly, young people understand that the most precious commodity that adults have is not money. They understand that the most precious commodity adults have is time. And so if you want to convey care to a young person, you spend time with them. As Camille said, I had a few very difficult experiences during my undergraduate years because of my health, which meant my relationships to teachers weren't always a matter of advancing a career. They were a matter of making sure I was healthy and safe and all of those things. I think that's why radical empathy was so huge for me. I was coming into contact with new identities. They were navigating space with me as a part of their support for me. This is absolutely essential that we take the time to do those things. In this place, Camille is talking about people who took time outside of their regular job to do this work, because that is how young people experience care. And then finally, expertise. But it's a particular kind of expertise. It doesn't have to be credentialed expertise. You don't have to have letters after your name. Young people were very clear about that. It could be expertise based out of experience, for example, or life circumstance. But that knowledge has to be used not for your own glory or position, but to help them. That's how expertise gets enacted. And they were very, very clear that they do not want you to be their friend. They use words like guides, mentors, coaches, teachers, not buddies. They have enough friends, and often for a young person, their friend can be, like as the source of as much stress and trauma as anything else. They're not looking for more of that necessarily. So they want your expertise, but it just isn't going to play if you don't couple that expertise with care. 69% of young Catholics agree with the statement, a person's expertise does not matter if they don't care about me. It simply doesn't matter. You remember this chart? We looked at this chart way back at the beginning of the presentation. Trust for institutions is low. Trust for these, for the positions that come along with those institutions, low. But trust for relationships, especially people who do relationships in these 5 ways, combining these elements, is huge. So young people told us, you see this broken out by age, 13 to 17 and 18 to 25-year-olds, like how much do you trust people who do listening in these ways and well, and transparency, integrity, care, and then overall, we're in the 90th percentile. We're the 90th percentile. Relationships are where trust comes from in 2021, not big institutions. When we fail to notice and listen to what young people tell us about their dynamic, diverse, and changing religious lives, we lose the ability to be in relationship with them and serve them. That's the whole deal. We have to notice them. We can't make the burden of proof on them to come to us. They're just not going to cross the threshold of that institution, that metaphor or metaphoric or real institutional door, as they might have done once upon a time. One last thing here, because I know that we are heading into a new school year, obviously. We've put out this guide called The New Normal, 8 Ways to Care for Gen Z in a Post-Pandemic World. This is, here I made this really great graphic, bouncing, it's free, you can get it on our website. It's each key finding here, there are 8 ways. Each key finding is coupled with an exercise in empathy that you can do yourself to help put you in the position of the young people, remind yourself of what it might be like to walk in their shoes, and then you can turn around and use that exercise to lead them through something similar. We've seen people have been telling us that it works really well in that regard. And lastly, if you want to hear more from young people, I would recommend our podcast. Season 3 talks all about relational authority. We get young people to tell us in their own words exactly sort of how relational authority plays out for them. Every time we release a study, we do a new season of the podcast.